Welcome to the Industrial Revolution. I'm Caitlin.
I'm Sam.
I'm Tori. So Sam, what do you think the Industrial Revolution was?
It was the movement in which machines changed people's way of life as well as their methods of manufacture.
Exactly, but it's also how cities in Britain and throughout the world transformed during the 18th century. Also how textiles and iron industries developed the steam engine. It was able to run factory machines and was powered by coal, which was Great Britain's primary raw material. This engine played a huge role in the revolution because of things such as transportation, communication, and banking. How do you think transportation, communication, and banking changed production?
During industrialization, the number of manufactured goods increased and improved the life of the poor and working class. Did you know that the nature of production was the most immediate change in the Industrial Revolution?
Yeah, I did. This so-called revolution affected the common people's everyday activities. So let's take a better look into the Industrial Revolution. Sam, describe how transportation affected the growth of the revolution.
The growth of the Industrial Revolution depended on the transportation of raw materials and goods over long distances. Waterways, roads, and railroads were the main types of transportation that boomed during the Revolution. Although the construction of the railroads had the biggest impact on transportation of goods and other essential products. Along with progression of technology, the idea of communication sparked.
I'm surprised how much you know about this. You left off right where I was going to begin. So as the Industrial Revolution progressed, the level of communication had reached previously unknown heights. In response to the newly discovered communication, the banking system was developed. Sam, what do you think that meant?
The banking system is a network of institutions that provided services such as loans, deposits, and investments. Everyone had a part in using the banks. Many moved to areas with low population rates to experience just that.
Yeah, people moved from country to city for jobs due to changes in farming, soaring population growth, and an ever-increasing demand for workers. When industry grew, cities grew. The advances in the industries made more jobs available and increased the production of goods. These changes in the population drastically changed people's lives. Immigration led to the growing of cities, which also gave people in the cities more opportunities for going out and doing things.
Although there were more opportunities, life in the city was still tough. Factories that came up during the Industrial Revolution changed the way people lived and worked in a dramatic way. With the explosion of manufacturing and trade, the rich who owned businesses got even richer. As a group, the middle class saw enormous benefits from the Industrial Revolution. The growth of new businesses and factories created thousands of new jobs. The middle class itself grew into a size as occupations like merchants, shopkeepers, and accountants allowed the working class to lift themselves up on a social scale. Middle-class factory owners who were very successful were able to move into the upper class. Both the upper class and the middle class benefited from this revolution, except for the poor. Their lives changed, but didn't improve in the least.
Urbanization made families move to the cities in order to get work. As a result, these urban areas became more and more overcrowded, which made goods cheaper and allowed for more mass production. But there seemed to be bigger issues. The Industrial Revolution afforded women new opportunities and at the same time exposed them to new dangers. Generally, women who worked during the Industrial Revolution did so out of necessity.
During this time, many countries did not have welfare programs to aid the poor. Working was a matter of surviving. This was especially true for single women. Large numbers of women and children were employed in the factories of the Industrial Revolution, especially working in the great textile mills, because many worked with little to no pay. They couldn't afford the cheap food with their pay.
Along with the cheap pay, health and safety regulations also didn't exist, so women and children were often the first choice for hire. Injuries were common because of the poor conditions in the factories. People could easily lose a finger or maybe even lose their head trying to fix or operate some of the run-down machinery. Since the pay wasn't very high, many families lived in crowded houses. Some even shared 1 to 2 rooms. Towns expanded rapidly in the Industrial Revolution, but accommodation was scarce.
One of the defining and most lasting features of the Industrial Revolution was the rise of cities. In pre-industrial society, over 80% of people lived in rural areas. As migrants moved from the countryside, small towns became large cities. More people had lived in the cities than in rural areas for the first time in world history.
There was many opportunities, but there were also a lot of obstacles in the city. Enclosure and technical developments and farming had reduced the need for people to work on farmland. People moved to the cities to get accommodation and a job. There was 60% population increase in just 40 years. Cities were not prepared for this said increase. There were few building regulations, and builders had a free hand to build as they wished. Town administration was weak, poor, and too incapable. Government attitudes also played in a role. It was commonly thought that laissez-faire system, where governments didn't interfere in the lives of adult men, was the right to meet the demands of the urban new life. So as you can imagine, that didn't go over very well. Along with the unmanaged building, the working conditions were just as bad, maybe even worse, don't you think?
I'd have to agree. Working conditions were absolutely terrible during the Industrial Revolution, and it's not exactly like it was a small group. The working class made up 80% of the society. Employers could set wages as low as they wanted because people would work for almost any pay. They made an act called Combination Acts, which prohibited workers from forming unions. They could not bargain with their employers or petition for higher pay or better working conditions. This is why the unemployment rate was immensely high.
People worked 14 to 16 hours a day for 6 days a week, no vacation time or even paid leave. Besides that, most of the workers were unskilled and only made about $8 to $10 a week, which comes out to be about 10 cents per hour. That's if you're a skilled worker. Most unskilled workers were paid even less. Women received 1/3 or sometimes 1/2 the pay than men received. Children got even less pay. Owners hired women and children because they would work for less money. Owners who were only concerned with making a profit were satisfied because labor cost less.
The demand for cloth grew, so merchants had to compete with others for the supplies to make it. This raised a problem for the consumer because the products were at a higher cost. Their solution was to use machinery that made the cotton cheaper and allowed for a more efficient production of these materials. People flocked to the cities and factory towns in search for a better life. This newly enforced machinery allowed for more available jobs to the working class.
During this era, cities were the focus points of population and production. Manchester exploded into the center of textile industry. The population grew, 30,000 people within 21 years. The wealthy and middle class lived in satisfying neighborhoods. The poor lived in run-down neighborhoods. Some may not even call it that. In these neighborhoods, these tenements, which are tiny, crowded apartments.
Might I add how nasty those buildings were? These tenements had no running water and didn't have any sewage systems. People had to share community pumps. These pumps were just pits in the center of the neighborhood, where all the waste was dumped. After the pit was full, they threw all the waste into rivers and streets. Children would play in the streets and swim in the rivers even while they were full of the rotting waste. Not only would they swim, but many would even drink the polluted water that was flowing down the streets. This was also a contributor to the many outbreaks of diseases.
There was another problem that people faced in the industrial cities. The cities were growing too fast, but the diseases were growing much faster, to too many areas. Disease accounted for many deaths in the industrial cities during the Industrial Revolution. With a chronic lack of hygiene, little knowledge of sanitary care, and no knowledge as to what caused diseases, let alone how to cure them. As health conditions improved, so did the level of sanitation. But this didn't help diseases. Although during the 1800s, the cities only contained 3% of the world's population. Many of these diseases were spreading fast because of the cramped living situations, mines, and polluted water. Tuberculosis was the deadliest disease during this time. Health records show that 40% of the working class deaths in the cities came from said disease.
On a completely random note, during the Industrial Revolution, London became the center and pivotal point of international trade and industry. Previous to the revolution, London made most of its money through trade. London needed more workers to work with machines such as threshers and tractors. People went to London for work, which then caused cramped living conditions.
Fun fact, a stock exchange was established in London in the 1770s.
Technological progress, education, and increasing capital stock transformed England into the workshop of the world.
Before the 1800s, education was not free, and the poor children got what education they could in dame schools or Sunday schools. But by the 1800s, education became available for even the poorest people. In 1833, the government passed the Factory Act, making 2 hours of education a day mandatory for the children working in factories. The government also granted money to charities to help schools for the first time.
Yeah, not to mention how Manchester grew rapidly and famously to become the stereotypical industrial city. Its cool climate was ideal for textile production and had a perfect location, right next to the Atlantic port of Liverpool. The first railroads in the world later connected the textile town to Liverpool. As a result, Manchester quickly became the textile capital of the world.
Because of the textile production and ideal location, many immigrants were drawn to the city, so Manchester population exploded and reached 180,000. The mills paid relatively high wages, and they also employed large numbers of children. Families migrated to the city often and saw a considerable rise in their incomes.